Lou Hamilton from Audible Elegance of Cincinnati, Ohio. I have a store located in Old Montgomery in Cincinnati, across the street from Montgomery Cyclery. And please do subscribe. It allows us to continue to improve things as I can. This is actually one of the things we want to improve because some people consider this old school. We'd like to do some advancement in that area as well, but your subscriptions are what makes it possible. I thought I'd take a little time to delve into speakers and their nature. And you can see I've got East Coast and West Coast here. And the reason I use that is years ago, there was a reference to an East Coast sound and a West Coast sound. This was 50, 60 years ago. And I personally have changed it a little bit to what I call acoustical, and on the other side, sound reinforced. I'll just let it go at re. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I don't believe there's anything called a perfect speaker. They don't exist. And the reason they don't exist is because of the nature of how the music is produced. Acoustical is exactly what I'm saying. It's instrumentation that is not electronically amplified. And this can be your symphonic music. It can be all forms of bluegrass, any of that, or country, jazz. But those can also be over in this category too. So you're a little bit careful about that. Now, when you talk about sound reinforced, the most obvious one is rock and roll in that genre. And the reason I make this distinction is because your goal in any audio system is the reproduction of a live musical experience. And so you have to understand that the way things sound under West Coast is exactly because they're being played through essentially PA dumps or sound reinforced products with heavy amplification. And it has a different tonal structure because of the nature of the speakers and such used. Now, under the East Coast and West Coast sound, probably the most famous company that epitomified West Coast sound were really the original early JBLs. There was extensive use of horns and that type of driver system. The most famous in the tweeters being the Prism. When you go to acoustical, one name that comes to mind real quick is acoustic research. And this is where you're talking about acoustically suspended speakers as opposed to anything that's ported, which would typically fall over into this area here. And so depending upon the type of music that you like to listen to predominantly, it has a steering influence into essentially the sonic signature of the speaker. Some of the best acoustical speakers out there are oftentimes berated for the lack of dynamics. Of course, if we're going to talk dynamics, one of the big ones out there for dynamics is glitch. This is not to say that dynamics are not important, because if you listen to the symphonic music, you go from everything from triple pianissimo to triple fortissimo. That's quite a range in volume. So there's some dynamics involved in there as well. But it's a bit different than what happens in this area here. This is kind of starting the laying out, and when you're looking at speakers, you have to think a bit about what type of music you typically listen to. It's not that it has a dead hand control, but it does have this influence. Now I'm going to put another chart up here and go even further. Now, what's really important to understand with the imperfect speaker is this center here is perfection. And on the whole situation, you have to look at the different qualities a speaker has. And I just drew these out kind of randomly, but in one area you might have dynamics, okay. In another one you may have tonal, and you can go on and on around this wheel with different characteristics that people will describe what they like or dislike about a speaker. And since nobody has a perfect speaker that does all of these things correctly, what you kind of wind up with is a pattern where, it may be stronger in one area but weaker in another. And this is trying to figure out the balance when you're listening to it of what is your personal preference. Now, as I've done in prior videos, I will not yield on rhythm, pitch, or emotion, because these are the few things that should be happening regardless of all of these characteristics. This is the mark. When these things are perfect, you have a great band or a great performance. And these should be happening. The rest of this goes into the category of non-verifiables. So for example, if you only use one recording in trying to select your speakers, well, the tonal characteristic could in fact be affected by the microphone that was used, or what did they do in equalization. And the minute you put on a different recording, oh, this all goes to hell. So you have to use multiple recordings and over the breadth of the music you enjoy listening to. And the more intense you like to listen to a particular style of music, then you can start beginning to really concentrate on these other elements as long as these three are maintained. The minute you go hard on tonal and you give up rhythm, congratulations, you've now spent a lot of money putting a wedding reception band in your house. If that's what you want to live with, crash weddings, it'd be a lot cheaper. But a lot of people can get very hung up on the tonal. Now, the dynamics is kind of an interesting one because dynamics are very important to music. For those people who enjoy the Klipsch loudspeakers, Paul Klipsch was down in Hope, Arkansas, and people remember Hope, Arkansas. Hope, Arkansas was also during World War II the test firing grounds for our artillery systems. We're talking, the big guns, big artillery. And if you want to talk about dynamics, be around something that's being fired like that. I spent a little time down at Fort Knox with the tanks during Army ROTC. There's some real dynamics there too, between quiet and very loud. So that was kind of where Paul Klipsch came from when he was designing his speakers, because he went for horns. He wanted that dynamic range. He understood that as part of the music. People will quibble perhaps with the tonal characteristics of Klipsch. They may quibble with other things, spatial characteristics, any number of things. But very few would, challenge horn drivers in terms of dynamic capability. My experience with speakers that are capable of tremendous dynamics is that it's very hard to keep them quiet or play them softly. And I relate to this because at one time WGUC was using compression. I talked about this in another video. They were using 2-to-1 compression. And I told them that things sound a lot better when you turn the compressors off. Well, they did. And they immediately said, my God, it does sound a lot better. Yes. But then they also started getting a lot of complaints because there were a lot of people who like to listen to WGUC on their little table radios in the office. And so when you had much greater dynamic range between the difference between loud and soft, well, they would turn up the radio to hear the soft, but then when it got really loud, it would bother other people. So back went on the compressors to make their listening audience happy again. And so in the commercial world, some consideration has to be given to who pays your check. And that was a good example of it because they use fund drives to support themselves. So you can put any characteristic around this wheel that you want to think about. And you might even go, on one of these spokes may be dealing with the bass and how deep will the bass go in frequency. Now, if you get too focused on bass, what you can wind up with is what I refer to as thump therapy, or something that you typically hear driving by you in a car. It's not really enjoyable, but you got a lot of bass. So you have to balance all of these different characteristics. But there is no such thing as a perfect speaker. So you take the East Coast, acoustic suspension type sound, acoustical instruments. You have the West Coast sound, as I said, the JBL, and this sort of sound reinforced sound. You start out with that as a basic framework, and then you start adding in these characteristics. And if you want to make it a little more difficult for any one person to guide you on this, is that we all hear differently. We all have greater or less sensitivities to the range that we can hear in relation to other pitches based upon our life experiences. I've had my hearing actually frequency swept by an audiologist, and I know where my weak spots are. So I perceive other sounds more so than other frequencies. So you overlay that in terms of perception, again, which makes building a perfect speaker simply impossible. So that's my take on going out there and thinking about the speakers you want to buy for your system. I guess one of the other kind of interesting overviews of this is if you have a hybrid system, which is both home theater and music, because home theater is going to drive on the dynamic side, the excitement side. Again, this is where a lot of the sounds are artificial, explosions and things like that. Some of them are real, I suppose. But, all of the explosions and such in Star Wars were artificially created, because in space there is no sound. So I enjoy it when the Star Trek, what was it, the Search for Spock, where the one starship runs out of power and you hear it sputter like an engine running out of gasoline. That was kind of amusing, I wonder if that really occurred, sort of thing. No, it didn't. So these are the sort of things you look at. That's why really you have 300, 400 different brands of speakers. You may have 50 to 100 different brands of electronics, but when it comes down to source electronics, you're typically working with 5 to 10, really well known. And it's because the speakers have this impact on terms of East Coast, West Coast sound, and the characteristics that people most quickly recognize. And there we are. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.